In the history of American Cosa Nostra, the threat of violence is just as important as its use, and nearly every member and associate in its history is capable. There are individuals, however, who stand out even among their peers in the underworld. These mobsters are the 30 most feared wise guys in American Cosa Nostra. Number 10. Jewish mob boss and head of Murder Incorporated, Louis Lepke Buchalter. Louis Buchalter was born in the Lower East Side neighborhood of Manhattan on February 6, 1897, to Barnett and Rose Buchalter. He had one sister and 3 brothers, all of which lived legitimate lives and worked in respected occupations. One brother eventually became a dentist, another brother a college professor and a rabbi, and the third brother a pharmacist. Louis, or Lepke, a nickname given by his mother, was the only one of his siblings to drift over to the wrong side of the tracks. The family was working class, and Lepke's father operated a hardware store on the Lower East Side. Louis's father died in 1909 when Buchalter was only 12. Buchalter finished elementary school and would then find employment while simultaneously attending the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, where he was an honor roll student. Soon after, his mother moved to Arizona for health reasons, leaving Buchalter in the care of his older sister. It was around this time Louis started dabbling in a life of crime. On September 2, 1915, Buchalter was arrested in New York for the first time for burglary and assault, but the case was dismissed, and Buchalter's sister sent him to live with his uncle in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in order to get him out of the neighborhood. Buchalter did leave the neighborhood, however the neighborhood never left him. On February 29, 1916, Buchalter was arrested in Bridgeport on burglary charges and was sent to the Cheshire Reformatory for juvenile offenders in Cheshire, Connecticut until July 12, 1917. After his release, he would immediately and repeatedly clash with his uncle, who would end up sending him back to New York. Upon arrival, he would immediately return to his criminal activities as he was arrested on grand larceny charges. On September 28, 1917, Buchalter would be sentenced in New York to 18 months in state prison at Sing Sing in Ossining, New York. Buchalter was released on January 27, 1919, before returning a year later on a 30-month sentence for attempted burglary. Buchalter was released again in 1922 and began working with his childhood friend, mobster Jacob Shapiro. The two were a part of creating some of the earliest labor rackets by muscling their way into the garment union leadership. Initially, the duo worked for labor racketeer Jacob Little Augie Organ. Once they outgrew their need for his patronage, the two became the main suspects in Organ's murder, along with the attempted murder of Jack Legs Diamond on the Lower East Side's Norfolk Street in 1927. However, Buchalter and Shapiro were never convicted of the crimes. Once in control, they would threaten strikes unless weekly payoffs were collected. Buchalter's labor racketeering would eventually extend into other areas such as trucking and bakeries. The unions were profitable for him, and he kept a tight grip on them even after becoming an important figure in organized crime. Buchalter would later form an alliance with Tommy Lucchese, and together they effectively controlled the entire garment industry in New York. During his early years in the New York underworld, Buchalter would meet Charlie Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Albert Anastasia. As these mobsters rose to prominence after the Calamarese War, they would create the National Syndicate, which would become the governing body of organized crime throughout the country. When it was decided an enforcement arm was needed, Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia would put together a band of killers never before seen in organized crime. The press would dub the group Murder Incorporated. The members of Murder Incorporated were Italian and Jewish gangsters from gangs of the Lower East Side of Manhattan and the Brooklyn neighborhoods of Brownsville, East New York, and Ocean Hill. In addition to carrying out crime in New York City and acting as enforcers for New York mobsters Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia, they accepted murder contracts from mob bosses all around the United States. These orders would be handed down from the National Syndicate to Buchalter and Anastasia, who would then assign the hits. Many mobsters met their fates at the hands of Murder Incorporated hitmen, the most famous of which being Dutch Schultz, who defied the National Syndicate by putting an unsanctioned hit on prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Schultz would be killed on October 24, 1935, at the hands of Mendy Weiss, Charles Workman, and getaway driver Seymour Schechter. As head of Murder Incorporated, Louis Lepke Buchalter would become one of the most feared men in the city, only eclipsed by his Lord High Executioner, Albert Anastasia. In November 1936, Buchalter and Shapiro were convicted of violating federal antitrust laws. They were both out on bail at the time of conviction and decided to go on the lam rather than waiting around for sentencing or appeals. While evading authorities, Buchalter was indicted for his part in a narcotics conspiracy that smuggled heroin into the United States. Shapiro would turn himself into the authorities in 1938. However, Buchalter stayed on the lam and continued his illicit activities. During this period, Buchalter began killing multiple witnesses that could connect him to any criminal activity. As the manhunt intensified, there were calls from the National Syndicate for Buchalter to turn himself in. The syndicate found themselves and their rackets hampered by authorities due to Buchalter's publicity. Allegedly, a deal was struck consisting of Buchalter turning himself in and serving a shortened sentence on federal narcotics charges. Buchalter agreed, but upon turning himself in to both gossip columnist Walter Winchell and FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover, discovered that there was no deal and that he had been betrayed. On May 9, 1941, Buchalter was arraigned in New York State Court on the 1936 murder of Joseph Rosen, along with 3 other murders. Buchalter's order for the hit on Joseph Rosen, a Brownsville candy store owner, had been overheard by mobster Abe Relis, who turned state's evidence in 1940 and implicated Buchalter in a number of crimes. Also testifying against Buchalter was Albert Tick-Tock Tannenbaum. On November 30th, 1941, the jury found Buchalter guilty of first-degree murder. Buchalter appealed and lost and would be executed in Sing Sing prison by electrocution in the chair aptly named Old Sparky. Buchalter headed the most feared group of killers in the history of American organized crime. He was someone that you just didn't want to cross. His fearsome reputation will be a topic of discussion for historians and organized crime buffs for years to come. He is truly one of America's most feared gangsters. Number 9. Lucchese Underboss, Anthony Gaspipe Casso. Anthony Salvatore Casso was born on May 21, 1942 in South Brooklyn, New York, to Michael Casso and Margaret Cucchiulo Casso. The youngest of 3 children, Casso was influenced early on by the mafiosos that were entrenched in the neighborhood. One of the men Casso idolized as a youngster was his godfather, Salvatore Calambrano. Calambrano was a capo in the powerful Genovese crime family which maintained a huge influence on the Brooklyn docks. At 15, an already violent Casso joined the South Brooklyn Boys Gang. In 1958, he was arrested after a rumble against Irish-American gangsters. Casso later told author Philip Carlo that his father visited him at the police station and tried in vain to scare his son straight. At 16 years old, Casso dropped out of school and got a job working with his father as a longshoreman. During this time, Casso became an excellent marksman, firing pistols and a .22 caliber rifle that he'd rigged with a silencer at targets on a rooftop which he and his friends used as a shooting range. Casso would use these talents to make extra money shooting hawks and other birds of prey for pigeon keepers looking to protect their coops. It didn't take long for Christopher Christie Tick Funari, a Lucchese family mobster and leader of the 19th Hole crew in Brooklyn, to notice young Anthony and his penchant for violence. By then, Casso had adopted his father's nickname, Gaspipe, which the elder got because he would use a gas pipe to administer beatings on the docks. It wasn't long before the new Gaspipe was building his own reputation as a violent loan shark with a sick sense of humor. One story that showcases this dark humor was about a man on the docks who was bragging about his sturdy new steel-toed boots. Casso heard this and decided it would be funny to test those boots out by dropping 500 pounds on the man's feet using a forklift. The man ended up with multiple broken toes, which was all the funnier to Casso. Casso's reputation grew more and more fearsome by the mid-60s. He would be arrested 5 times between 1965 and 1977 on state and federal charges ranging from assault with a gun to heroin trafficking. All 5 cases ended in dismissals after witnesses refused to testify against him, and he would not see a day in prison. During this time, Casso and fellow Lucchese associate Vic Amuso led a burglary ring known as the Bypass Gang, which included expert locksmiths, safecrackers, and experts in security alarm systems. The Bypass Gang committed a number of burglaries of banks and jewelry stores throughout the decade and netted proceeds estimated at well over $100 million. In the late 70s, both Casso and Amuso would be made into the Lucchese crime family. Then in 1980, Funari was promoted to consigliere of the family and wanted Casso to take over as capo of his 19th hole crew. However, Casso declined and endorsed Amuso instead. Casso then opted to become Funari's aide-de-camp, as a consigliere is allowed to have one soldier work directly for him. Then in the years 1985 and 1986, the entire Cosa Nostra establishment would be rocked. The first event was the murder of Gambino boss Paul Castellano and underboss Tommy Bellotti, which was orchestrated by John Gotti, Frankie DeCicco, and Sammy the Bull Gravano. The second was the conclusion of the commission trial, where a large part of the leadership of the New York families were given life sentences, or sentences so long they were essentially life sentences. These events ushered in a new generation of leadership to La Cosa Nostra. After the Castellano hit, it is alleged that Amuso and Casso, with the blessing of Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, plotted with Genovese boss Vincent the Chin Gigante to murder the new boss and underboss of the Gambino family, John Gotti and Frank DeCicco. It was widely suspected that Gotti and DeCicco were responsible for the murder of their boss, Paul Castellano, which was carried out without commission approval in violation of long-standing Cosa Nostra rules and thus were marked for execution. On April 13, 1986, DeCicco was killed in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn, when his car was bombed following a visit to Castellano loyalist James Jimmy Brown Fiala. Gotti was supposed to be in the car also, but at the last minute decided not to attend the meeting. There was another mobster with DeCicco that was mistaken for Gotti, so the assassin, believing both were in the car, detonated the bomb. In November 1997, author Jerry Capisi reported that Casso, who was by that time already a government witness, revealed that the plotters selected Genovese associate Herbert Pate to kill Gotti with an improvised explosive device. Casso told investigators that the plotters decided to kill Gotti and DeCicco with a bomb in order to make the Gambinos think that Sicilian mafiosi were involved, as American Cosa Nostra rules prohibit bombs. Lucchese family boss Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo felt that he, underboss Salvatore Tom Mix Santoro Sr., and consigliere Christopher Christy Tick Funari would all end up in prison, effectively stripping the Lucchese family of the entire administration. It is alleged that Corallo called both Casso and Amuso to Funari's Staten Island home to discuss succession of leadership. Casso again pushed for Amuso, and it was agreed that Vittoro Little Vic Amuso would become the next boss. Casso would eventually become consigliere, and the two would usher in one of the most treacherous and violent periods in the Lucchese crime family. The Amuso-Casso reign would begin with Vladimir Reznikov. Reznikov was attempting to extort Marat Balagula, a Lucchese partner in the famous gasoline tax scam. Reznikov would be executed by Joseph Testa on Anthony Gaspipe Casso's orders. Casso and Amuso were also responsible for the infamous Whack Jersey order, where contracts were put out on the entire New Jersey crew after Capo regime Anthony Aceturo refused a direct order to increase the family's share of their profits. Aceturo was particularly enraged that Casso and Amuso also had ordered the assassination of his wife. Casso alleged during interviews with Philip Carlo that Aceturo had involved his wife in the running of the Jersey crew and that therefore Aceturo alone was responsible for the contract put on her life. Aceturo, however, considered the contract on his wife a violation of the American Mafia's long-standing rule against killing mobsters' relatives who are not involved in the life, and he chose accordingly to break his blood oath and cooperate with the feds. Then in 1986, Anthony Gaspipe Casso was shot 6 times by an unknown assailant. Using detectives Stephen Caracappa and Luis Eppolito, both on Casso's payroll, he was able to track down the perpetrator. Jimmy Heidel was snatched by the detectives and delivered to a Lucchese safe house where Casso and his associates tortured Heidel in order to discover who else was involved in the plot. After learning that Gambino's soldier Angelo Ruggiero was behind the hit, Casso emptied the clip into Heidel, killing him. Nicholas Guido was mistakenly identified as being involved with the attempted hit and was shot to death outside his home on December 25, 1986 by Joey Testa on Casso's orders. The murders continued in 1987 when former member of the Bypass Gang, John Otto Hadel, was suspected of informing. He would be shot to death in October of 1987 while fixing a flat tire on his car. Another member of the Bypass Gang named Dominic Costa would also be suspected of informing. As a consequence, he would be shot in the head numerous times on October 12, 1988, but would go on to survive the attack. When Carmine Sessa, a Colombo mobster, turned state's evidence, he would confess to Costa's murder attempt. Both shootings were on the orders of Amuso and Casso. In an emerging pattern, Thomas Red Gilmore was suspected by Amuso and Casso of being an informant. On February 6, 1989, Thomas Red Gilmore was shot to death. Another name on Amuso and Casso's hit list was John Sonny Morrissey. Casso suspected Morrissey of cooperating in the Windows case. Casso then ordered Pete Chiodo to kill Morrissey and bury his body where it would not be found. Chiodo and several Lucchese family members shot Morrissey to death and then buried his body near a stone wall. On August 24, 1990, another member of the Lucchese family, Bruno Facchiolo, was stabbed and shot to death on Casso's orders. An increasingly paranoid Anthony Casso ordered the killing due to suspicions that Facchiolo was a rat. Others that met their demise during this reign of terror include Michael Papadillo, Anthony DeLapi, and Michael Salerno. Casso is also believed to have ordered the deaths of Gambino soldiers Eddie Lino and Bobby Borriello. It didn't matter who you were or if you belonged to another family. If Casso wanted you gone, you were going. In early 1991, Amuso and Casso ordered the murder of Capo Regime Peter Chiodo, a fellow Windows case defendant who had pled guilty without asking their permission. The order shocked acting boss Al Diarco because Chiodo and Casso had been close friends for years. Chiodo survived the attack, after which Casso threatened to murder his wife if he testified. This was the last straw for Chiodo, who turned state's evidence shortly after. His sister, Patricia Capozalo, was shot while she was driving in Bensonhurst. Capozalo sustained bullet wounds in the arm, back, and neck, but survived. On February 2, 1993, the body of Frank Signorino, Peter Chiodo's uncle, was found frozen solid in the trunk of a car in East New York. Signorino had been slain by multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Things would take a turn when on July 29, 1991, due to a tip-off from an unidentified Lucchese insider, Victor Amuso was arrested. As a result, the Lucchese capos asked Casso to take over as acting boss. Casso reluctantly accepted. His leadership on the street would not last long. On January 19, 1993, Casso was arrested while coming out of the shower at a house he shared with his mistress, Rosemarie Bellotti, in Mount Olive, New Jersey. Casso would become a cooperating witness and make a deal with prosecutors to join witness protection. He would later violate that agreement and would end up spending the rest of his life in prison. Federal prosecutor Gregory O'Connell later told author Jerry Capisi that the decision not to use Casso as a witness was made in the Bellacci suite, while Casso, with apparent delight, gleefully laughed as he described how he buried alive a young drug smuggling associate in the Florida Everglades. Both he and fellow prosecutor Charlie Rose flew back to New York City convinced that Casso's knowledge of Mafia secrets did not matter. O'Connell later told Capisi, "It gets to a point where somebody is just too evil to put on the stand." Anthony Gaspipe Casso died from COVID-19 complications in ADX Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. During his time on the streets, some historians estimate he has ordered, been involved in, or personally committed close to 100 murders. Most of the people who knew him feared him. He is without a doubt one of the most feared mobsters in the history of American Cosa Nostra.